welcome to Module 5, the last module in Communication Studies 400, Research Methods. In this module, we'll be talking about quantitative research methods and the analysis of quantitative data. The first chapter, chapter 14 in this module, covers content analysis, and as I mentioned last time, this can be both a qualitative and quantitative approach to the analysis of communication data. So basically what this is a process of placing units of analysis into categories, and the data that we can use could be a text, a book, a newspaper, observations that we make in the field, self-reports from participants, advertisements from magazines or television shows, TV shows, movies, songs, artworks. So you get an idea that it can be pretty much anything can be used as data in this approach. So what we're doing is taking something, let's say a text, for example, a newspaper article or a series of newspaper articles, and we're taking and placing words or paragraphs or sentences or ideas from that text, and those are what are called our unit of analysis, those words or phrases or sentences, and placing them into categories. So we're trying to see, does one particular category occur more frequently than another type of category? And this is a very common form of analysis, particularly in the media studies area. Then another very common approach to the study of communication data is survey research. And here what we're doing is gathering data on participants or another's attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, perceptions, values. So the researcher could be asking you about those attitudes or beliefs, or the researcher might be asking you to tell us what you think about that other person. What does that other person believe, or what does that other person do? So for example, if I'm studying relationships, I might ask you how frequently you tell your significant other, I love you, or I might ask you about your partner. How often does your partner say I love you to you? So it can give us two different ways of studying the same thing. We could have open-ended or closed-ended questions. So an open-ended question would be, I'm sure you're familiar, so what is your belief about some concept, and you just provide an open response. Closed-ended questions would be using the levels of measurement that we talked about in an earlier chapter. So if I asked you what your sex was, male or female, then that's a closed-ended question. Or if I asked you, or if you were using a Likert or Likert type scale, strongly agree, strongly disagree, which is an interval level of measurement, that's a form of closed-ended questions. Then another thing that comes up with survey research is the issue of time. So we could do cross-sectional or longitudinal research. So cross-sectional research is when we're doing something, asking participants about one particular moment in time. Longitudinal research occurs over time, so we're measuring the same concept, but maybe we're doing it every day for a week, maybe we're doing it every month for a year, or for 5 years we're doing it every year. So the amount of time that separates each of our measurements or collection of data can differ. Then another form of quantitative research method is experimental research, and here what we're looking for is we're trying to test the effects of one variable, which would be the independent variable, on another variable, which is the dependent variable. And so what we're trying to do here is establish a causal relationship that one variable, the independent variable, causes a change in that dependent variable. So maybe we're saying that we believe that the hours that a student studies influences their GPA. So the hours that they study would be the independent variable, and then the grades would be the dependent variable. The problem here is that it's hard for us to determine which comes first. So maybe you're getting good grades and that causes you to study more, or vice versa. So it's very difficult for social scientists to establish a cause and effect relationship. The data can be collected through observations, self-reports, or other reports, so we might use survey methodology to collect some of the data in an experimental design study. The other thing that comes up in the issue of experimental design is that the researcher is attempting to establish control through manipulating the independent variable and randomly assigning participants into groups. So manipulating the independent variable is, you might be familiar with pharmaceutical research where some participants might receive the actual drug and other participants receive a placebo. So that's the researcher's manipulation of that independent variable. Then we also have random assignment of participants into groups. And so it's important to remember there's a difference here between random selection, which we talked about earlier in sampling, where we're actually recruiting the participants into our study. Now we're talking about random assignment. So this is, how do we put people into our groups that we're comparing? So how do we determine who receives the treatment and who receives the placebo? And the best way to do this, the highest level of control, is with random assignment of participants. Then the other thing that you'll read about in Chapter 18 are the different types of experimental designs. And these could be pre-experimental designs, quasi-experimental designs, or true experimental designs. And these vary based on the amount of control that the researcher has in the particular experimental situation. Then the last section of this Module 5 will be discussing quantitative data analysis, and this is in two chapters, Chapter 16 and Chapter 17. And this is divided into descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. And as the name implies, descriptive statistics is when we're trying to describe the data set that we have. So we can talk about measures of central tendency, which you've all heard about, the mean, median, and mode. The mean, you're very familiar with. This would be the average that occurs. So what are the average number of hours that a student studies, for example? Measures of variability or dispersion. And so this, one example of this could be the range. And so if we're talking about the age of our participants, we could talk about who's the youngest participant and who's the oldest. So the range in our sample could be, the participants were from age 19 to age 45. Then inferential statistics discussed in Chapter 17, and I know that this can be a little confusing, but the most important thing to take away from this chapter is to understand when is it appropriate to run these different statistical tests. So given the type of hypothesis you have and given the type of data you have, which test would be appropriate for you to run. So what we're trying to do here is make conclusions or inferences from the sample that we have to the population that we drew that sample from. So if we know something about the sample, and particularly if they've been randomly selected, we can then make inferences or conclusions about the population that's been drawn from. And there are two different types of tests. We can do tests of difference. So here we have t-test, f-test, ANOVA, and chi-square, and you'll read about each of those and when those are appropriate to run. The other type of inferential statistic that you'll read about in Chapter 17 are tests of relationship, and these could be correlation or regression. And here what we're trying to do is, rather than say that there's a difference between our variables, we're trying to say that there's a correlation or a relationship between the variables. So we say that there might be a relationship between hours of study and GPA, as opposed to we think there's a difference, where we might say that students in communication studies have higher GPAs than students in psychology. There we're looking for a difference versus looking for a relationship between our variables. So the tasks that need to be completed in Module 5, this last module, are to read Chapters 14, 15, 18, 16, and 17, watch the related video material for each chapter, answer one of the 3 discussion questions for this module, complete quizzes 8, 9, and 10, and then submit portions A, B, and C of the research proposal. And this will be your final submission of the paper. And let me talk a little bit about this last section. So you'll be revising portion B based upon the feedback that I gave you. Then you'll be adding portion C to your revised portion A and B to create one complete paper. So you'd be adding section C, portion C, to your already completed and revised portions A and B. Portion C is the method section. Now, this is really the heart of what we've been discussing in this class, and so The syllabus, I think, is very clear and the guidelines are very clear. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this. But you'll be discussing your sampling procedures, ethics, particularly if you're using human participants in your study, the procedures for collecting your data. So if this is a survey, for example, how are you going to administer your survey? If it's an experiment, how are the participants going to go through your experimental procedure? How are you going to measure your variables? So one of the things you'll notice is that throughout the guidelines I put if applicable. So if you're not doing, I'll describe experimental procedures, but if you're not doing an experiment in your study, you don't need to write about that. So that's an error that students often make, is that they'll write about all of those procedures, say they're doing survey research, but then they'll write about experimental research when they're not doing an experiment. So make sure you're only answering the questions that are appropriate to the design of your particular study. Then the analysis, I want you to take your best stab at telling me which of the which of the statistical procedures discussed in Chapter 17, t-test, ANOVA, correlation, for example, would be appropriate given the type of study and type of data that you're collecting. Then tell me what are any limitations in your study. You might address particularly reliability and validity. And then what are any future directions for research in your study? One of the things that's also important is to include the appropriate appendices for your study. So if you're doing survey research, I want you to develop the survey instrument and attach that as an appendix. If you have human participants, you need to include the consent form that you would give to the participants. And so all of these appendices are described in the syllabus, in the guidelines for this paper. So make sure that you look at those. If you have any questions while you're doing this, please don't hesitate to either post them to the discussion board, class questions, or email me directly. This section, portion C, is 4 to 6 pages added to what you already have for section or portions A and B. So please don't hesitate. I know this portion of the paper can be challenging. Look at the samples that I've put up on Blackboard and ask any questions that you have along the way.